wasn't the man you expected. Not with his tailored suits, clean-shaven jaw, and a bowler hat tipped just so. Not with his polite tone and those calm blue eyes that looked more fit for a poetry reading than a gunfight. But beneath the civility, behind the cane and the card table, was something sharper, quieter than thunder, but just as deadly. Bat Masterson. To some, he was a killer in a bowler hat. To others, a gentleman gambler with a pistol under his coat. He wrote with wit, fought with precision, and lived with the quiet confidence of a man who'd faced death and didn't flinch. He didn't look the part, but he played it better than anyone. This wasn't the West of Dime novels. It was colder, bloodier, and sharper. And Bat, calm, deadly Bat, walked right through the heart of it with polished boots and steady hands. This is Chronicles of the Old West. This season, we bring you a new tale, a true tale. This is Steel and Silk, the legend of Bat Masterson. And it begins here, in a quiet lobby in Gunnison, Colorado. Where smoke hangs thick, stories are traded like currency, and a legend leans casually on a billiards cue. This is Episode 1, Between Truth and Thunder.
August 1881. The place Gunnison, Colorado. The Tabor House Hotel stood at the center of town like a cathedral of frontier fortune, its whitewashed facade catching the gold of the sinking sun. Inside, the grand lobby pulsed with the quiet tension of men who had seen too much and said too little. Tobacco smoke curled upward like ghostly ribbons toward the high, tin-tiled ceiling. The air was thick with the murmur of card games, the soft clink of glasses, and the dry laughter of prospectors still coated in mountain dust. At a corner table beneath a gas lamp that flickered like a tired eyelid, a correspondent from the New York Sun sat hunched in thought, tapping his pencil against the edge of a half-filled whiskey glass. He had come west, chasing blood and legend, gunfights in dusty alleys, desperados with black hearts and quick hands, lawmen who dispensed justice from the barrel of a Colt. He was after the mythic frontier, the stuff that sold papers east of the Mississippi. But so far, all he'd found were boomtown pretenders, broken dream miners, and sheriffs who spoke like clerks and wore their pistols more like paperweights. His deadline loomed. His pages were empty. That's when fate stirred the whiskey. From across the room, a man approached, dignified, clean-shaven, a pair of spectacles resting lightly on the bridge of his nose. Dr. W. S. Cockrell, physician by trade, storyteller by calling, the kind of man who could prescribe morphine with one hand and a tale with the other. He leaned down, voice low, eyes glinting with mischief, and something else, history. "You want a story?" he asked. The journalist leaned forward instinctively. "There's your story," the doctor said, nodding toward the open doorway of the billiards room. The reporter turned. There stood a man in a tailored suit, cut from fine cloth that looked almost out of place among the dust-streaked boots and canvas coats of the lobby crowd. His boots were polished, his mustache trimmed. One hand rested in his vest pocket, the other held a billiards cue like a duelist's blade. He was poised, silent, watching the room without needing to stare. There was something about him, stillness like coiled tension, calm like the eye of a storm. The doctor spoke again, this time slower, as though unveiling a holy relic. "There is a man who has killed 26 men." The words didn't so much shock the reporter as awaken him. They hung in the air like black powder smoke after a volley. The room didn't notice, but something had shifted, like a breeze before a lightning strike. The reporter's fingers flew to his notebook. Pencil to page. Finally, he had come west to find the legend. And it was standing 30 feet away, framed in the doorway like a statue carved out of reputation and myth. His name was W.B. Masterson, though most men never called him that. On both sides of the Mississippi, in places where names were currency and reputations weighed more than silver, he was known simply as Bat. No frills, no fluff, just Bat. And in the dusty tongues of the frontier, that name carried weight. It clinked like a chambered round. Tales of gunmen were as common in the West as prairie dust. Every saloon had a story. Every bartender had a cousin who claimed to know someone who'd stared down a killer. But this one smelled different. Not like whiskey breath and overtold lies. No, Bat Masterson's story didn't come loud or begging to be heard. It came quietly, on polished boots, and behind cool, unblinking eyes. It wasn't the number, although 26 dead men was nothing to scoff at. What made people pause, what made the old-timers lean back and lower their voices when his name came up, was the man himself. He didn't look the part. Well-dressed with tailored coats and a bowler hat tipped just so. His vests were pressed, his collars clean. His voice, when it came, was soft, measured, closer to a school teacher's than a killer's. He carried himself like a gentleman, spoke with a kind of slow civility, and had eyes that seemed made for poetry, not pistol work. The kind of eyes that could study a Shakespeare line or count the heartbeats before a man hit the floor. But those eyes had seen things, and they had aimed true more times than anyone could count. Bat's reputation wasn't the sort built by drunks boasting in backroom poker games. It was forged in fire and tempered with truth, shaped by gun smoke and the cold mathematics of survival. The West didn't hand out legends easily. It earned them. Some said that once, in a nameless frontier town, Bat had walked into a street-side war against a gang of thugs. They had holed up in a building across the way, thinking themselves safe behind locked doors and the false courage that comes with numbers. With a revolver in each hand, he was known to shoot equally well with both. He charged the building. Witnesses claimed he threw himself against the door with both feet, splintering it open like a force of nature. And then, like a whirlwind of judgment, he entered. He fired, crossed wrists forming an X, bullets flying right and left with precision. 4 men dropped where they stood, still gripping their weapons, surprise frozen in their final breath. 3 more panicked and fled, scrambling for horses, boots slipping in the dust. They didn't get far. Bat pursued them, cool and relentless. One by one, they fell before they reached the edge of town. The last was said to have turned and begged, hands raised. Bat didn't flinch. The law, he later claimed, had already been passed. That's how the story went, at least. And that was enough. In the West, the line between truth and tale was thin, and just as easy to disappear into the wind. Whether he shot 7 men in one showdown or 3 across a year didn't matter much. The story, published in The Sun under the headline, "A Mild-Eyed Man Who Has Killed 26 Persons," was a smash. Reprinted from New York to Dodge City, it caught fire like dry timber. But when it finally landed back in Kansas, Bat's old stomping ground, it stirred more than just admiration. It raised eyebrows and blood pressure. Because Bat Masterson wasn't some dime novel cowboy. He was a living, breathing contradiction. Part gambler, part gunman, a lawman who often walked just outside the law. His story, like the West itself, was one where myth and truth danced so close they nearly became one. The Kansas City Journal found him not long after. "Bat's bullets," the headline roared. The reporter wrote, "He is a medium-sized man, weighing perhaps 150 pounds and reaching 5 feet, 9 inches in height. His eyes are blue and gentle in expression. And withal, he is about as far removed in appearance from the Bowery frontiersman as one could well imagine. He was no brute. No brute could keep his mustache as neat or his language so gentlemanly." When asked about his body count, Bat smiled. "I've had a great many difficulties." Difficulties, he said. That was how Bat described a life in the West. Truth be told, no one really knew how many men Bat Masterson killed. He was tried 4 times for first-degree murder, acquitted 4 times. As for the rest, let the stories do the talking. Who was Bat Masterson, really? He was not born in a log cabin on the Kansas frontier, nor beneath the open skies of Illinois prairie. His story begins farther north, across the border, in the chill air and green pastures of Henryville, Quebec, in the year 1853. A place not yet touched by the dust and gunpowder that would later define his name. At his baptism, the priest did not speak the name Bat, nor William Barclay, the name he'd later adopt with a gambler's flair. No, the name written in the church ledger that cold November morning was Bartholomew, a name more fitting for a cleric or a scholar than the man he would become. Where Bat came from? Well, like much of his legend, that part depends on who you ask. Some say it was a tribute to Baptiste Brown, a frontier hunter whose silent footstep and unerring aim had once earned him mythic status among the plainsmen, a comparison not lightly made. Others claim it came later when young Masterson, still limping from a gunshot wound, took to carrying a cane, not for fashion, but for leverage. They say he used it not just to walk, but to bat down the unruly in Dodge City saloons, cracking skulls with the same precision he once reserved for the rifle. Still others insist the nickname was born simply from the cadence of Bartholomew, clipped and sharpened by the rough-edged tongues of the West until it became one syllable: Bat. Whatever its origin, the name stuck. It clung to him like dust to boots. And soon it echoed across newspaper columns and telegraph wires from Denver to New York. Bat Masterson. A name that could stop a card game mid-hand. A name that, once spoken, never needed explaining. But before the myth, there was the man. And before that, there was a journey. Bat's father, Thomas Masterson, a hardscrabble farmer with big hands and bigger hopes, packed up his young family and left the frostbitten edge of Quebec in search of something better: land, liberty, a place to plant roots and raise boys who would inherit more than stones and timber. They crossed the border and kept going, through upstate New York, into the heartland, touching briefly in Illinois, brushing against the shadow of St. Louis, always westward, chasing the moving edge of America's promise. In 1871, they found it. Or thought they did. Sedgwick County, Kansas, just northeast of Wichita. A patch of wild ground nestled between 2 of the rowdiest cattle towns in the West, Newton to the north, Wichita to the south, and only a few miles from the buffalo-rich prairies that stretched like an ocean to the Rockies. Farther west still, beyond the horizon, Comanche territory waited like a sleeping dragon, its breath hot with resistance. It was here that young Bartholomew, just 17, first tasted the air of chaos. It didn't taste like fear. It tasted like possibility. He helped build the sod house, sure, plowed the fields, hauled water, did his duty as a farmer's son. But the fields couldn't hold him. The furrows were too straight, the prairie too quiet, and the horizon whispered stories the rows of corn never could. By the next spring, he and his older brother Ed were gone, out on the buffalo range, armed with a Sharps rifle, and the kind of hard resolve that only boys with dreams and nothing to lose can muster. It was there, under a ceiling of stars and in the shadow of buttes, that Bat began to shape himself, not with words, but with emotion. He learned to read the wind, to measure the angle of a shot by instinct, to track the dark movement of a beast across the grass without a sound. The buffalo didn't forgive mistakes. Neither did the Comanche. In that brutal, beautiful silence, he learned how to survive. It was a landscape of wide danger and narrow chances, where every sunrise could end in gunfire, and every handshake could hide a knife. There were no second guesses, only quick draws and quicker decisions. And it was in that vast expanse where time slowed and consequence lived in every shadow that Bartholomew, the son of a Canadian farmer, became Bat. Before he ever raised a badge or drew a gun in a dusty saloon, Bat Masterson stood ankle-deep in blood and mud on the buffalo ranges of the American frontier. He was not yet a lawman, not yet a gambler or a gunfighter. He was a boy, barely 18. But the wild was already carving its lessons into him. With every sunrise, every shot, every hide skinned from the steaming carcass of a fallen beast. This is where the West sharpened its edge and where Bat Masterson began to walk that razor's line. In 1871, the great slaughter had begun. The plains, once black with the movement of millions of buffalo, were under siege, not by nature, but by progress. Railroads were hungry for land and leather. Industrial belts and tanning machines back east needed hide. And so the buffalo, long considered the lifeblood of the Plains Indians and the king of the prairie, became a commodity, measured by dollar signs. Bat and his older brother, Ed, just teenagers, left their father's farm in Sedgwick County and headed south to Stone's Store. There, they joined a buffalo hunting outfit bound for the Medicine Lodge River. Their job? Skinner, stock tender, grunt labor. But it didn't matter. They were out on the frontier now, where thunder rolled from the barrels of the mighty Sharps' big .50 rifle. They traveled deep into the Nescatunga region, where buffalo herds moved like oceans of muscle and bone. Each morning, the boys would wake to the sound of gunfire, distant and rhythmic, like a slow, methodical drumbeat of death. They watched as hide hunters crept through the prairie grass like wolves, rested their rifles on crossed sticks, and fired into the herds. One shot, one kill, through the lungs, and the buffalo. They stood there, dumb, unmoving, watching their comrades fall without panic, until the lead cow dropped, and then they scattered. It was execution. Bat learned fast. When the herd was down, the wagons rolled forward. That's when the real work began. Knives cut hot and fast through thick hide and sinew. The stench was unbearable. Flies swarmed. Blood steamed in the cold morning air. They peeled the hides back using saddle-hitched ropes, loaded them into wagons, and staked them out to dry. The meat? Left to rot, except for the tongues, which were hauled back to camp. A delicacy, if you could stomach the sight of what surrounded them. They worked 7 days a week. Winter came hard and fast. Skinning knives slipped from numb fingers. Carcasses froze stiff before the boys could finish the job. But from the top of any rise, Bat could still see them. buffalo stretching to the horizon, as far as the eye could see, and soon, as far as they would ever roam. The camps themselves were alive in their own way, with the rough camaraderie of shared hardship. Here, Bat met names that would echo through his future like gunshots in a canyon. Billy Dixon, Old Man Keeler, Bermuda Carlisle, and one name in particular that would follow him all his life: Wyatt Earp. They met in the dead of winter, when the Kansas wind cut through canvas tents like knives, and the only warmth came from buffalo hides and bad whiskey. The year was 1871, the place somewhere between the frozen creeks and low hills of the high prairie. Snow dusted the plains, fires cracked low in dugouts and camps. Wyatt was 24, already carved by the West. He'd crossed the country by wagon, been a teamster, a scout, a lawman. He carried himself with a kind of rigid silence, as though every word cost him something. Tall and lean, with blonde hair and a mustache that fell like curtains over a tight mouth, he looked like a man who had made peace with violence. Bat was barely 18, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, eyes too sharp for his age. Where Wyatt was solemn, Bat could flash a grin. Where Wyatt walked like a man who'd buried his past, Bat still had the spring of youth in his step. He hadn't yet become the legend, but there was something in him that drew attention. A spark, a stillness behind the eyes that promised action. On the surface, they were mismatched. The stoic veteran and the fresh-faced buffalo skinner. But anyone who spent more than a few minutes near them saw it. An unspoken bond forged not in words, but in manner. It was in the eyes. Both had the same cold, pale stare. Blue-gray, clear as ice, and just as merciless. Eyes that saw everything. Eyes that weighed men like scales. Not cruel, but calculating. Eyes that had already seen enough to know how things end and how to survive them. And when they looked at each other, they recognized it. Not just the look, but the steel behind it. That winter, while the rifles cracked across the plains and the carcasses of buffalo steamed in the snow, a friendship was born. It was quiet, like the men themselves. No grand declarations, no drunken oaths of brotherhood. Just nods across campfires, shared whiskey, long hours in saddle and silence. Trust earned not with talk, but with action. They weren't heroes yet, not gunfighters or marshals or gamblers in silk vests. They were still boys in rough coats, learning the code of the West one blister, one rifle shot at a time. But make no mistake, they were training for something. Out there, in that bitter landscape of blood and cold, they became brothers of the range. They watched each other's backs. They shared what little they had. And more importantly, they measured each other in moments where lesser men faltered. The bond they formed wouldn't break. In the years to come, their paths would diverge. Bat to Dodge, to Denver, to New York. Wyatt to Wichita, to Dodge, to Tombstone. But the wire between them would hold taut. And when trouble called, when lead flew and reputations were on the line, they answered for each other. But all of that was still years away. For now, they were just two men on the edge of nowhere, sleeping beside buffalo hides, sharing firelight and silence. And though they didn't know it then, the West had found its pair of kindred spirits, cut from the same cold cloth, bound by the same code, and destined to leave a mark the world wouldn't soon forget. It wasn't just rifles Bat was learning to handle. The buffalo camps were rough schools. The curriculum, whiskey and cards. Both were everywhere. Whiskey wagons peddled firewater out of barrels, and the hide men lined up tin cups in hand, never asking what was in it. Some drinks were spiked with red pepper, some with rattlesnake heads. Didn't matter. What mattered was the burn. Bat drank what the men drank and lived to tell the tale. Later in life, he'd become infamous for his ability to hold his liquor. But it started here, in sod dugouts and under canvas tents, where the West poured itself raw and strong. And then there was the gambling. Bat watched, then played, then learned. Poker, Monte Faro, it wasn't about cards. It was about people. He learned to read bluffs, sense weakness, and when needed, call out a cheater with more than words. By the time he was 20, Bat Masterson had become a man. Not in the soft ways of the cities, but in the only way the West respected, by surviving it. In the spring of 1872, Bat and Ed took a break from the buffalo slaughter. They signed on to help grade track for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. A subcontractor named Raymond Ritter promised them good pay for backbreaking work near Fort Dodge. They worked like men possessed, sweating under the raw sun of the Kansas plains. The land was dry, cracked like old leather, and the work was relentless. Pickaxes splitting soil, shovels lifting clay, wagon wheels grinding ruts into the prairie. This wasn't glamorous frontier living. It was labor, muscle and blister, breath and blood, pushing the frontier westward inch by inch in steel and sweat. Bat and Ed Masterson weren't hunters now. They weren't gamblers or gunmen or names men whispered about in saloons. They were just two more bodies in a grading crew helping lay rails across the open country. The railroad had a deadline: reach Colorado by 1873 or lose everything. That meant men worked sunup to sundown, no days off, no excuses. They laid down 5 miles of grade between Fort Dodge and Buffalo City. Dirt flew, calluses thickened, muscles ached, but there was promise in the work. Ritter had offered good pay, $300 between them, a small fortune, to young men trying to claw their way out of poverty and onto the frontier stage. And then he vanished. No farewell, no receipt, no trace. Ritter left with their wages in the wind. At first, they waited. Maybe he'd return. Maybe it was just a delay. Days passed, then weeks. Every morning brought the same truth. They'd been had, swindled, lied to. Their sweat had bought them nothing but dust. For Bat, it was the first betrayal. The first time he tasted that particular poison, being cheated by the kind of man who steals with a smile. It wouldn't be the last. In time, Bat would come to know that men with pens could be more dangerous than men with pistols, and that the West, for all its talk of honor, was just as full of snakes as any city back east. Bat would not forget this incident, and when the time was right, he got what was his. But that is a story for another time. Broke, bitter, and disgusted, Bat and Ed loaded what little they had into a wagon and headed back toward a place they understood, the Buffalo Range. They found it again in the camp of Tom Dixon and Jim Wyatt. If the railroad had been about back-breaking labor, this was something else entirely. Brutal efficiency married to calculated slaughter. Tom Dixon wasn't just a hunter. He was a machine, a businessman of blood. In a single stand, he once dropped 120 buffalo in 40 minutes, burning out the barrel of his Sharp's Big 50 from sheer overuse. Over the course of 1 month, he laid waste to over 2,000 head. He didn't hunt for sport. He hunted like a man filling orders. Jim Wyatt, Nixon's partner, had a face carved by the wind and eyes that had seen everything. Tall, angular, hawk-nosed. He'd fought Indians, Mexicans, and time itself. Wyatt had once survived a siege by 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne near Fort Phil Kearny. When men told stories around the fire, they lowered their voices when White's name came up. Together, Nixon and Wyatt ran one of the most ruthless and efficient outfits on the plains. They didn't tolerate weakness, they didn't ask questions, and they didn't waste time. The Masterson boys fit right in. They knew how to move, how to kill, how to skin. They had the rhythm in their bones now, the silence before the shot, the smell of blood and cold air, the way your hands stung when they gripped a hide-stained knife in the dark. There was no glory in it, just money, just survival. Bat, who had been swindled by Ritter's soft lies, now found comfort in the sharp honesty of the buffalo range. The only deal here was between hunter and herd, and that deal ended with a crack of thunder and a steaming carcass in the snow. This was the West, as raw and unforgiving as it would ever be. And Bat was learning to match it, step for step, shot for shot. By now, the plains were thick with hunters. 10,000 men, some say, prowled the range. The skies echoed with the roar of big .50 rifles, and the carcasses of the mighty beasts rotted by the tens of thousands. This was the peak of the great slaughter, a war of man against nature, and man was winning. But even amid this carnage, amid the daily roar of the sharps' rifles, the stink of rotting carcasses, and the endless numbing rhythm of kill, skin, repeat, friendships were forged. Maybe it was because life on the buffalo range stripped men down to their rawest selves. There were no pretenses out there, no room for false bravado. A man was either useful or he wasn't, brave or dead. You didn't survive because you had a fast mouth. You survived because you knew when to speak, when to shoot, and when to be still. And in that stark, stripped-down world, Bat Masterson met Billy Dixon. Dixon was already something of a legend by the time their paths crossed, just 22, but carved from the same stone as the frontier itself. He was long-limbed, quiet as dusk, with the steady hands of a man who never flinched. His eyes were always scanning the horizon, like he could see farther than most men dreamed. Indian fighter, scout, buffalo hunter, Dixon had already worn a dozen hard-earned titles, and none of them were given lightly. Bat, still rough around the edges, watched the hunter closely. There was something in Dixon's manner that demanded respect, not through loud stories or showy marksmanship, but through silence, precision, presence. Dixon didn't need to tell you how far he could shoot. You just knew. He carried himself with a kind of stillness that could settle a whole camp. In that, Bat found a kindred spirit. They were opposites in some ways. Bat was more likely to grin, more likely to gamble, more comfortable with words. But beneath the surface, they were cut from similar cloth, steel tempered by hardship, fiercely loyal, and utterly unafraid to walk into fire if it meant standing by a friend. Bat would later write, Billy Dixon was a typical frontiersman of the highest order, cool, calculating, and uncommunicative at all times. Dixon, in return, once described Bat as a chunk of steel, and anything that struck him always drew fire. By the fall of 1872, the campfires burned a little brighter, and the circle of familiar faces grew larger. The Masterson outfit was no longer just Bat and Ed. Their younger brother, Jim, had joined them, eager, 17, and hungry for the kind of adventure that only the buffalo range could provide. Not long after, an old friend from Sedgwick, Theo Raymond, arrived on the plains, and with him came his younger brother, Henry. Henry Raymond brought something no one else in that camp carried, a pen and a diary. Where others kept memories and scars and stories, Henry recorded them with ink, or, when it ran out, gunpowder mixed with water. His journal became a raw, unvarnished account of frontier life, equal parts blood, bone, and the quiet moments in between. He stepped off the train in Dodge City just before dawn. The town, still more promise than place, was little more than a scattering of tents and the skeletal bones of a rail line. But already, the saloons were awake. He followed the glow of lamplight through the morning chill and found himself face to face with his first true glimpse of the West. A card table surrounded by weather-beaten men, stacks of poker chips glinting under gaslight, and one player seated with 2 Colt revolvers resting plainly beneath his blouse. It was a silent warning. Here, the stakes were real. Henry was pointed toward Tom Nixon's home, where he was told to wait until his brother returned. Dodge, they said, wasn't the place for a greenhorn fresh off the train. He listened. And a few days later, when Theo arrived with a wagon load of hides, Henry followed him out to the camp at Kiowa Creek and into the heart of the buffalo trade. What followed was a crash course in buffalo hunting. They hunted daily, 10, sometimes 20 buffalo in a single day. They pegged hides, hauled meat, boiled coffee in the snow, and kept fires burning against the bite of the wind. It was brutal work, repetitive, exhausting, and relentless, but it was life on the plains. And for the Raymonds and the Mastersons, it was becoming a rhythm they knew by heart. Even in that hard existence, they found moments of levity. On Christmas Day, with the prairie frozen and the buffalo scarce, the camp held a shooting contest. Ed and Bat proved the best marksmen, no surprise to anyone. That night, the men gathered in a dugout for a dance, if it could be called that. With no women for miles, the hunters paired off themselves, half of them playing the part of the gentler sex, twirling and stomping in rough imitation of a quadrille. Henry played the fiddle. The music echoed off sod walls and into the bitter night. And for just a few hours, laughter replaced gunfire. Out there on the frontier, with nothing but snow, firelight, and good company, the West had never felt more alive. Then came the storm. January 1st, 1873. The men loaded the wagon with buffalo hams and tongues, nearly 1,000 pounds, and headed for Dodge. But the snow came fast. They lost the trail. That night, they bedded down in the open, buried in snow, wolves circling. Henry shot at shadows just to stay sane. By the time they reached Dodge, frostbitten and exhausted, the meat wouldn't sell. Disillusioned, Henry, Ed, and Jim decided to head back east. They sold the meat for a penny a pound and prepared to leave. But not Bat. He wasn't going back. The prairie had changed him, hardened him. And as his brothers rode off toward the safe familiarity of Sedgwick, Bat Masterson stayed behind in Dodge City, where law was a loose idea, and a man's worth was measured in nerve. He was ready for the next chapter, and Dodge was ready for him.
And so begins the story of Bat Masterson, buffalo hunter, gambler, gunman, and something else entirely. He didn't ride in like the heroes of pulp novels, spurs clinking and pistols blazing. He walked in quiet, calculated, watching, a gentleman's coat on his back, a steady fire in his chest. Before the headlines, before the courtroom trials and the clashes on frontier streets, he was just another boy on the Buffalo Range, ankle deep in blood, grit beneath his nails, carving out a place in a world that didn't offer second chances. The West was unforgiving. So Bat learned to match it, step for step, shot for shot. His story isn't just one of gunfights and gambling halls. It's about survival, about transformation. A Canadian farm boy who crossed borders and boundaries to become one of the last true figures of the Old West. defined not by volume, but by precision. Here at Chronicles of the Old West, we're committed to bringing you not just the legends, but the layered truth beneath them. Every scene you've heard is built from historical records, first-hand accounts, newspaper clippings, and the rare moments when Bat himself left something behind in his own words. We've shaped those facts with narrative care to bring the man and his time back to life. If this episode stirred your curiosity, if it made you see the frontier in a new light, or introduced you to a name you'd only seen in the margins of Western lore, consider leaving us a rating or review. Share it with someone who still believes stories matter, because this is just the beginning. The man in the bowler has many roads yet to walk, and not all of them lead where you expect. Subscribe now and join us for the next chapter in the life of Bat Masterson, right here on Chronicles of the Old West.